If you move on. The other thing is with the capital ships, once we actually put them in, we want to try and build them in a way that makes it easier to then do the other.
There's a reason he's leaning in here.
Manufacturer. Keep going. No. Do the other ships of that exact same manufacturer. So like once we do one RSI, we want to set ourselves up so that we can roll into the others a lot easier.
So we want to start with RSI because doing the Polaris first helps reduce the amount of work needed for the Perseus and the Galaxy. So those three will likely be like a chain of dependencies from each other.
Kind of shared assets.
Yeah, there's a lot of shared assets between them.
So I'm going to mute him here for a second here. And I'm going to go ahead and watch it again and make sure that I'm not missing anything key. But that one line right there kind of triggered that. I think during IAE last year, I had a really quick segment. Well, not quick. It ended up being about an hour long, where I kind of said that the whole argument that there's hundreds of ships in the backlog isn't necessarily true. And I thought that might be good to do that again and just kind of explain the reasons why, but in its own dedicated segment. So that's what I'm going to do here. But what John just said there was pretty important, that they take certain dependencies from each other. When they build a ship, they're building an asset pack for the rest of it. So if that sounds interesting and you want to stick around and kind of see what ships are still in production, let's get this. Okay, so you might have seen this before. I've certainly used it before. This is the StarJump fleet viewer, and links in the down below section. StarJump actually has his own channel where he regularly talks about ships. So if that's the kind of thing that interests you, he does a great job. As you'll see, these models are all fully textured up and 3D rendered and everything. So he does a great job. Check out his channel. But what I'm going to do is actually go through the ship matrix, and this is on the development tab of the RSI page. So, I mean, you can see it here, Comlink Community Development tab, ship matrix right there. They actually have the ships in order that they were concepted. And so I am going to do the same thing. I'm going to go through from the oldest ship to the newest ship. And I've got 4 categories of ship here or vehicles, and some of them all fall like multiple categories, cover one ship, and it's kind of reasons why they're still in development or in concept, why they're still JPEGs. And so those 4 reasons are they're in the game, and there's some extenuating circumstance why the ship is going to get a rework. It's kind of in production. They're finished with it, but there's something kind of screwy. It was done long ago. You get the idea. The next kind of ship that's on this list that hasn't entered production yet is because the tech isn't in yet. There's some sort of aspect of it that doesn't work. So a good example with the whole C, actually the SRV is a good one, that they haven't finished tractor beams yet. And so the SRV isn't in. The whole C isn't in because they needed to have all those nested physics grids working. They needed to have the big cargo boxes. There's a lot of tech that isn't in the game. The next category is that the game loop isn't in. So something like the Pioneer is a prime example. Pioneer is an example of both the tech and the game loop not being in because we don't have any ship that can build stuff yet. And then the last category is the capital ship. And you can kind of see that even with just the couple of ships that I've mentioned so far, there's multiple categories, like the Pioneers, all 3, obviously. And so let's go ahead and get into this. We'll start going in order, and I'll just start clicking through this and pull you in and go into each ship. I am going to end this this intro with a caveat. That I usually start most of my shallow dives, which I'll have another one on Wednesday on the roadmap. But these are just my opinions. It could easily be that there are things that CIG has on the back end, why they're not releasing one ship or the other. And I'm not privy to those. So I am just kind of giving my opinion on these. And that's all this is just kind of my opinion based on being a backer on this project for 10 years and just kind of following the roadmap pretty closely as long as they've been producing it. But the real subject matter experts on this are CIG. So if John Cruz says something that contradicts something I say, John Cruz the one that knows. I'll leave it there. One last point I'd want to put on this is that one thing that John said there, where he said, we're going to try to do these 3 ships in order for this reason. I think it would be good to have like a Friday show with just John Crew and kind of have him go through the ships that are still in concept and kind of be, these are the blockers for this ship. This is the tech that needs to be implemented before you will see this ship come in. And I think that that would be advantageous to CIG because it would kind of stop the whole, where's my Polaris thing? Where's my Kraken? Where's my Merchantman? Stuff like that. If he would say, this is the tech that needs to be in. These are the game loops that need to be in. This would be the art style guide that we need to have in place before we can build ship X, and just kind of do that for the concepts. And as you'll see, there's not as many concepts as people think there is. So with the intro out of the way, let's go ahead and get into this, and I'll have timestamps in the down below parts so that if you're looking for my opinion on a specific ship, I'll have it in there. So the first one up is the Starfarer. In this case, I pulled the Starfarer Gemini, but it has the same issues. And you'll kind of notice I'm going to punch through these pretty quick. I'm not going to belabor the point and kind of go into the whole design history of each of these ships. I'm going to pretty much say what's going on with the ship, why it's either not in its finalized state yet or whatever. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and get this. So the Starfarer, they're gutting the entire thing. This was one of the first, I think it was the first big ship they made. And no one had done like working ship interiors before, so they weren't too sure what they were doing. They had some FPS level designers, so think Counter-Strike and stuff like that, building an interior of the ship. So if you walk around the Starfarer, it's like walking through an FPS level. There's lots of little ways to hide. There's lots of little ways to sneak around to get behind things because it's an FPS level. It would be an awesome deathmatch level. The problem is that it sucks as a ship you have to navigate. Most people go in through the cargo bay, up around, into the bridge, and never touch the rest of the ship because it is a nightmare to navigate. So they're gutting this ship and they're going to redo it. The gameplay is in. So this one falls into the category of it's in, but it's in the game. They have refueling working, so its game loop is in. The tech is in largely. In theory, the the Starfarer is supposed to have some ability to refine, and it was originally supposed to refine gases, but now Quantanium is a physical asset. It's an asteroid, so will it be doing like hydrogen and helium, maybe water vapor or something? Who knows? We don't know, but it has some refinery aspect. We know they're working on refinery ships. So its game loop, I would say, for this ship is probably 90% of the way in. It's a refueler, and that works. It's pushing the line on a capital ship. Even now, the Starfarer is one of the bigger ships we have in the game. But Starfarer Gemini, that's where we are on it, or the Starfarer in general. It's in the game, but it's going to go through a significant rework. So next up is the Caterpillar. Kind of falls into the same category as the Starfarer in the sense that it's obviously in the game now, and for a lot of people it's their daily driver, although C2 is largely replaced it, although it's kind of seeing a comeback right now because of salvaging, because you can open up those side doors and mining and throw the salvage material into the Caterpillar. It's really good at that, which has made its utility kind of stand out, and as a Mirai carrier, or not a Mirai, a Fury. But the trick to the Caterpillar, one of the things that makes it particularly special is that all of these cargo containers here are modular. Those will be able to be pulled out and switched out for different modules. So think like you could have a medical module or a salvage module, space bike launcher module. They've had a few different versions that they've kind of thought about it. And this command center right here, this command pod can actually break off and fly its own ship, which is also a kind of a form of modularity. I think it uses the same underlying tech. They've apparently solved that issue. So Caterpillar is in another category of it's in the game, but waiting on tech in this case. Okay, next up is the Retaliator. Same situation as the Caterpillar. It's in the game. You can fly it right now. It launches torpedoes, but like John was saying, they've solved the issue. One of the big issues with the Retaliator was that in order to have the Retaliator shoot those torpedoes, the torpedoes were linked to the ship rather than the torpedo module. And so if you were to pull the torpedo module and put in the cargo module, you would have torpedoes through there because they were linked to the ship and not the module. So the torpedo wasn't talking to the module, talking to the ship. The torpedo was talking to the ship, or you couldn't shoot them. So the Retaliator in the game, but waiting on tech to meet its full functionality of the modularity. So obviously this is the Idris, and to a certain extent it's in the game. CIG has said that we're not getting the player version, and the Javelin falls into the same category, so I'm just going to knock them both out with a picture of the Idris. CIG says we're not getting it until they release Squadron 42. So while we have like an outer shell of the game, and I think they might release the Kraken the same way when Pyro drops, just because it's the outer shell of these ships is much easier to make than the whole working interiors. And that's essentially what the Idris is in the PU right now. In Squadron 42, it's probably, I would hope by now, a working interior. But they don't want us to have it because they don't want to have spoilers for Squadron 42, which makes sense. That's the downside of doing those two games concurrently, which we could have an argument about, but it is what it is. So Idris is in the game, but... So yeah, I told you I'd rocket through these. So this is, of course, the Band of Merchantman, which anyone that's watched this channel for any length of time knows that this is my baby, that the whole reason I backed the game when I did was basically for the concept of this ship. And even though I have a giant fleet of ships, that entire fleet of ships, I have for other people to fly and command and crew this to protect or supplement this ship that I will be in. So obviously Band of Merchantmen kind of hits close to my heart, but the reason it's not in the game is because each one is a unique piece of art. And take a shot here, all of the innards on it are bespoke. I think one of the things that might help CIG here is to make a medium, think like not quite Carrick size. Think something like more Connie sized. Make a Banu ship that's around that size, because right now the only Banu ship we have is the Defender, and there just isn't enough art cues to build something of this size. So if they were to build something that was Connie sized, they'd have an asset back. So the roles of the game loops for the Merchantman are largely in. We have cargo trading. It is missing some of the tech, and some of the game loops around trade isn't in yet, like the ability to have those stores. And it's a capital ship. So unfortunately for the Band of Merchantman, there's like 3 hits against it. Well, 4. It's unique and alien, which you'll kind of see. I'll mention this at least one more time. So that's working against it because it's a capital ship. So not only is it something that they have to come up with a whole different style guide for that's unique, but it's a capital ship, so it's huge. So it's going to take a long time, even if you had a style guide, to build it out. And that's one of the reasons they put a pin in it. The tech isn't really in yet because they don't have all of the features that this thing is going to have, and the game loop for trade isn't in. They don't have the tech for stores yet, and they don't have the game loop for trade. Like, actually, I have this gun that I will sell to you for this amount, and you can buy that lot, and we have the transaction, and you own it now. That isn't really in the game yet, to a certain extent, at least to the extent they need to do. So Band of Merchantman, 4 strikes against it, maybe 5. And that's why it's currently awaiting production. All right, so this is the Hull C. Next up in the line in order of concepted. Obviously in production, in theory, we're getting it for 3.20. And a comment related to the Hull C was actually one of the things that triggered this, because somebody was like, hey, paying for a JPEG. It hasn't been a JPEG for a long time. They've had the ship. That's just the knocks on it are that the tech for the huge cargo pods weren't in. The tech for the folding wings wasn't in, or the arms wasn't in, so the physics grid wasn't in. And this will be the case for all of the whole series, except for the whole A, which obviously we have in the game. And the game loop, to a certain extent, wasn't able to handle something like the whole C. So trading on a big scale, which the whole C definitely is, I think it has like, what, 3 to 4 times the amount of cargo that a C2 does. And even a C2 right now, you're having to go to multiple places just to fill up the hold. The C2 will be that times 4. So, and it can't land on the ground while you're putting cargo in there. So the whole cargo game loop is going to have to change for this game. And links in the up above part for the little bit that I did on the whole C and what it means for this game as a whole. But the whole C, we'll say the whole B, whole C, whole D, whole E are all kind of waiting on the same things. Whole C is going to be the concept that rolls that out. But right now, tech, and to a lesser extent, game loop, where we're holding up the whole series. Now, this big bad boy is the Orion. So this is the capital ship of the mining game loop. And right now, I would say the game loop for mining is pretty much sorted. The tech is largely sorted. What's stopping the Orion right now is it's a capital ship. So one strike against it. Also, they're gonna need assets for the Orion that it can mine. Like this thing will be mining asteroids the size of a Starfarer, and we know that there's another RSI miner out there. We voted for it, so we know it exists. It's probably one of the unannounced ships that's going to be like a Starfarer size miner that will probably come out with those new assets that only the large miner in the Orion can mine. So yeah, so that's the strikes against the Orion. They've kind of white boxed it out a couple years ago, just kind of an exploration. I would not be shocked if they have to go back and gut all of that and do it again. So, I mean, you can see that they kind of did the exploration on it, but they didn't, it's in no sense finalized, and that was years ago. So Orion, kind of waiting on asset packs. It's a capital ship. It's an enormous capital ship. Hang on. Sometimes people forget just how big this thing is. This is how big this thing is. So capital ship and a little bit of game loop. I would say maybe a hair of tech. Not a big priority because they've got enough mining ships in the game. Also at this point, with most of these capital ships, one of the underlying issues of a capital ship, on top of the investment of time and dev time and number of devs that have to work on one, is the game itself, the engine, isn't really at a place where you can really run a ship that has a crew of more than 3 people. You can do it as like a one-off, but there's no NPC crews. Engineering game loop isn't in yet. Multi-crew gameplay out of sitting in a turret, either mining or salvage or a gun turret, isn't really in. There's no reason to have multiple people on your ship, and there's nothing for them to do if they were there than to just kind of sit and look at things. So when I say capital ship, that's always going to be a part of it. So let's go on. So technically the Javelin fits before this ship, like right before this ship, but I already talked about the Javelin when I talked about the Idris. So if you're looking for the Javelin, click back on the Idris and you'll see it. This is the Genesis Starliner. So this was the first Crusader ship, and you can sort of tell even now that the style guide for this ship is, they took some elements of it for the C2, but it's clearly different. This looks like a different manufacturer from the same people that brought you the MSR, the Ares, the C2, and so on. So this is gonna get a rework. This one, I would almost put this in capital ship status when they go back and redo it. It shouldn't be much larger than the C2, or the Hercules, so it's gonna be subcap to large ship sized. Okay, so maybe it's not a cap ship, but game loop and tech isn't in yet. This is a passenger carrier. NPCs don't know how to walk onto your ship and sit down and order drinks, which is kind of this game loop. The whole getting paid for carrying people and NPCs from point A to point B isn't in yet. The tech isn't in yet. So this one, bigger ship, not capital, but bigger ship, waiting on tech, waiting on game loop. So this is the Endeavor. This is the Endeavor Hope, which Sinister, who's one of my best friends, he and Knight are two of my best friends in the world. He works in the medical field in the real world. And so the Endeavor Hope was kind of one of the ones that he was looking at. And nowadays he's kind of thinking maybe the Galaxy would be a little bit easier to run. And we'll get into that one too. But this is the Endeavor Hope. Tons of tech on this one, including game loops, capital ship. This is another one that kind of has everything working against it. This right here, and I'll come back to this. This right here can break off a lot like the Caterpillar's command module and go off and fly on its own and just kind of leave this as a base. These parts here are modular and can be fitted out for different things. Like they've got a farm, a big radio telescope, which who the hell even knows how that'll work in the game. It's got this hangar. They've got a big particle accelerator that'll be able to overclock components, which we don't know what that is. So this thing is another one of those ships that has just every strike against it. It's a capital ship. The tech isn't in the game. The game loop isn't in the game. Yeah. One thing I'll say though, and I'll be coming back to this one in a bit. This is the Odyssey. And keep in mind that this was a very early concept of this ship when they didn't quite know how big these ships would have to be. This right here is a full-size hospital, to give you an idea, like multiple floors. So obviously everybody knows the Endeavor is going to be growing a lot. The front of this ship, the command module, looks an awful lot like the Odyssey, and it would make a lot of sense to have the Odyssey be the command module of the Endeavor. But I'll be coming back to the Odyssey in a bit. So the Endeavor has a little ways to go. It's going to be a while until we see it in the game. Like there will have to be a lot of game loops, a lot of tech rolled into the game. So earliest we'd see it is like 5 years. Maybe. So this is the Crucible, and this one's kind of seeing a little bit of a revival in the community right now, which is kind of cool because it's one of those ships that I kind of felt was sort of a sneaky dark horse that not many people knew about, and it just kind of flew under the radar. But this is sort of the capital repair ship, which is a loop that we really haven't seen in the game. We've just kind of seen the bare minimum of it with the introduction of the salvage tool being able to spray on armor over damage on your ship. This will be able to do this on a grand scale. This right here is modular and can be dropped off. It's basically a big garage that when originally concepted could fit a Hornet. It could fit a Hornet in it. Probably going to grow a bit. Just the metrics on all of these really early concepted ships have grown a bit. But King repair ship, obviously, put this one, depending on how much it grows in the reconcept, maybe a subcap size, maybe a capital size. I would be surprised if it got that big. But yeah, large ship, so it's going to take dev time. The game loop isn't in the game yet. The tech isn't in the game yet. So 3 strikes against it. So a ship that's arguably at least as popular as the Banner Merchantman is the RSI Polaris. Cool thing about this one is that it's actually in production right now. Probably by the time this video comes out, they will have actually started working on the ship itself. To this point, they've been working on kind of the pre-planning and reconcepting because, again, this is an older ship before they kind of came up with their latest metrics for ships. This one is pretty strong, and it kind of becomes obvious why as the next capital is coming in. Game loop is combat. That's in the game. Tech, it doesn't really have any game breaking tech. It doesn't have modularity. This front doesn't break off and do something else. It doesn't transform. It has this hangar bay, but we've got working hangar bays on other ships. It's got huge torpedoes. Other ships have torpedoes. So there's no tech holding this back. There's not a game loop holding this back. Basically, the only thing that was holding this back was its size. It's a sub-cap ship. It's a Corvette. It's like kind of the king of the Corvettes. The good thing about this is that the style guide that this ship produces, which I'll mention that they have the bangle for Squadron 42, which makes me a little bit worried that if they're waiting for asset packs for RSI, they should have gotten it with the bangle. So I'm wondering if that's a little bit of a miscommunication, but what this will mean is that these three ships will probably be hot on each other's heels. This is the Polaris, the Perseus, and the Galaxy. I am guessing it would probably go 1, 2, 3. Just this being a newer concept was practically almost white box. Most of it is empty space. The only thing that might stall up the Galaxy is the modularity. But anyway, as far as the Polaris is concerned, each of these will have their own little section. Don't worry. So the Polaris will actually act as a gateway, and I'm glad to hear this, that they'll kind of cluster cap ships together, which means when they do MISC, like when they do the Odyssey, they'll probably do the Odyssey line. They'll bust out a few of those Odyssey ships. So we'll see. Could be an interesting year. But don't get me wrong, Polaris, big ship. People that are thinking that's coming out in September are drunk. Don't listen to them. This thing will take probably maybe not a full year, again, just because it doesn't have a lot of moving parts, but it might be IAE of next year would be the earliest I would look for it. The absolute earliest would be IAE. So like September to November of next year is where the window would start. I would say that window would end like June to IAE of 2020. I don't think it'll take that long. Maybe Invictus of 2025. I would not be shocked if it took that long to do it, but we'll see. It's going to take them a while. So this is the 600i. It's in the game now. It works. The insides, kind of like the Starfarer, are an absolute mess. They're gutting it. It looks like they've kind of put a pin in the production on the 600i for right now, which is kind of a shame, or at least the Explorer version. We'll see on this one. I don't think it would take them too long. I think right now the problem is devs. They just don't have enough devs to work on all the big ships, so they're kind of prioritizing where can we get the most bang for the buck. The 600 is in the game. It works. People are happy with the externals at least. So it's taking a lower priority to something like the Polaris, which isn't in the game and a huge amount of the community is really excited about. So it makes sense. 600i, yeah, again, the exploration loop is still a little bit fuzzy, but it's in process in the game. But for when I think this one might be done, that's a better question. I would think that they would try to drop this one on IAE this year, just given how far we saw the white box or the gray box on the exploration was. But given how much more work has to go in, it's hard to say. They have a pretty good style guide thanks to the 400i that they could pull assets from. And the 890 jump for that matter. But yeah, again, with this one, I'd say that's more dev time and just what those devs are working on. So maybe next year, hopefully this year, maybe next year. So this monster is the X1, and this is a space bike from Origin. Speaking of Origin from the 600i, it was concepted right after the 600i. So there's a lot of it's simpatico with it. So my theory for a while was they were going to try to release the rework of the 600i and the X1 at the same time. X1 is a tiny ship, should not take them long to get this one out the door, so they might just release the X1. This is weirdly one of Paul Shelley Astropub's babies, which I get. The X1, at least design wise, is one of my favorite space bikes, so I kind of wanted to, but we'll see. We should see this one at IE. Now John has said they're going to start working on it real shortly, which kind of tells me this week, and in theory that's what the deliverables view is telling us too. A few weeks. I would not be shocked to see the X1 at the latest IAE of this year. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have this. This is the Pioneer, which is the capital ship for Consolidated Outlands. Consolidated Outlands has a few issues because they really don't seem to have a coherent style. So, I mean, you could sort of see that all of their ships, like the Hover Quad, the Nomad, I'm having a hard time of even thinking of what their other ships are. The Mustang, they're just kind of all over the place style-wise. And the Pioneer is no different. So they don't really have a style guide that you can go into and be like, oh, that's definitely a Consolidated Outland ship. So this thing might be having the same problems that the Banu Merchantman has, in the sense that they don't really have a good style guide for ship interiors for Consolidated Outlands. So what does it look like? They're going to have to start there. So Consolidated Outlands Pioneer has, again, it's another one of those ships with a lot of strikes against it. It's a capital ship, like a huge ship. Its game loop isn't in. We aren't able to build any sort of outpost yet, and that is this thing's whole job. They do have Rastar, so some of the tech does exist right now. Right now it's dev facing tech, but it's eventually going to be player facing tech. They've said that many times, that Rastar will be what the Pioneer uses. I would expect to get a large ship, so kind of like I was saying about the Banu Merchantman, where they kind of need to make a medium-sized Banu ship to kind of get a handle on what that race is. They kind of need to make a medium-sized Consolidated Outland ship that builds stuff, medium to large, that builds outposts or builds something in order to get a handle on like the tech and the game loop before they roll out this monster. But yeah, that's the Pioneer. We're not seeing it for a while. This almost falls into Endeavor territory, where the game loop is so far out, who knows when we'll see it. So this is the Vulcan, which is kind of the forgotten, beaten stepchild of the Star Citizen universe. It is kind of the tow truck. Tow truck's the wrong word. So the SRV is the tow truck, or more like the tugboat. The Vulcan is kind of the AAA, goes out and fixes your ship or refuels your ship. Like you're stranded on the side of the road. The Vulcan is the one that's going to show up and do just enough to get your ship to someplace where it can be really repaired. It'll be a great go-between ship between something bigger like a Starfarer and, let's say, a small number of ships. When I was talking about my vision of how both the Carnival will work and how my fleet will work, the Vulcan kind of plays that sort of intermediary role, where you have a ship that kind of, a component is doing something haywire, the Vulcan would carry out a new component to it and be able to fix it with its drones, be able to refuel ships, where you don't want to commit a whole Crucible to go out and fix a, say, Prospector. You could commit a Vulcan and you're not like putting a major asset of your fleet out there. Vulcan will have a huge place in the verse. Relatively small ship. So roughly in that sort of Freelancer to Connie range, size-wise. I would not be shocked if this one came on the roadmap next year. It would be a great test bed for repair, drones, and refueling's already in the game. So this one, mildly tech, mildly game loop. It would be the perfect kind of ship to roll out for the repair game loop. Kind of like how the SRV is kind of being rolled out for tractor beams. I could see the Vulcan being the same thing next year. I would not be shocked if the Vulcan came on the roadmap next year, or even at the end of this year. Stressing, come on the roadmap, not completed. They'll start production on it. So this is the Apollo. It is a mid-sized, a little bit smaller than the Connie, which is kind of interesting on its own. If RSI were to make like a freelancer competitor, this platform would be a pretty good platform to go off. Triage, or the Apollo, is kind of that perfect size category. Right now, game loop, medical game loop is in. The tech for it is in. And its style guide for RSI is pretty well established. We know they've been working on the Apollo, kind of reconcepting it a little bit late last year. So we know it's kind of on their radar as far as a ship to be worked on. So again, much like the Vulcan, I wouldn't be shocked if the Apollo came on the roadmap next year. Like they have the Cuddy Red out there. Which this is kind of the next level up. It has bigger beds. On the deliverables, we've got the sort of what I consider the next tier of medical gameplay, where it starts dealing with cybernetics and DNA degradation and things like that. Running something like the Apollo and healing someone on one of their beds might be beneficial to that kind of stuff, over getting someone in like the crash cart sort of combat medic situation that you're dealing with the Cuddy Red. So it might be levels of what you're willing to deal with or pay for. The Apollo series will give you a lot more options. But as far as why it's not in the game, there's no real big blockers for the Apollo at this point. Is probably just number of devs and what they want to focus on. So this one's more priorities than the big four. It's not a capital ship. Its tech is in the game. Its game loop is in the game. And yeah, that's it. So it's good shot. I could see it coming back on the roadmap next year, especially if they get more devs. So the MSR, the Mercury Starliner, this one is on the list as it's in the game, and this one, probably of all the ships I'm going to show here, is probably the lowest priority on CIG's sort of list of ships to fix. There's just a few things on the ship that don't make a lot of sense. It only has the one entrance on the back ramp, and they've admitted, yeah, that was kind of an oversight. I think that we would probably put another entrance over here. The inside is a little goofy. Like they made a lot, and I've hammered this before, so I'm not going to go into it too badly, but they made a lot of concessions to kind of shove those crawl spaces in there. And I think that they could kind of rework the ship a little bit to smash it down a little bit, make it a little bit sleeker and faster, and just sort of have little cubby holes. Like even on the Millennium Falcon, which this kind of was inspired by the Millennium Falcon, those are just bolt holes. They're just little smuggler holes. They weren't entire Jeffries tubes and crawl spaces worth of stuff. They all basically piled into the trunk of a car and hid down there until the stormtroopers went through the ship. That is more what the MSR needs. But low priority, but they have said, yeah, we kind of want to look at that one later. So cross your fingers. Long ways off. The Kraken. So this one comes up a lot. I could see this one getting the Idris treatment initially. In fact, I would really be shocked if they don't already have an exterior Kraken ready to go for Pyro. And what I mean by that is that it will be used by pirates in Pyro. But you might be able to steal one and sit in the bridge like you can do with the Idris now, but you're not going to be running around on the inside and playing around in the Dragonfly Bay or anything like that, or the Cargo Bay. It's just going to be an empty shell. I could see them rolling something like that out. but strikes against this one. Game loop is surprisingly in. It's a combat ship. It has landing pads, which other ships have now. The tech for it is largely in. You can land on landing pads. Other ships have landing pads. The big thing against this one is obviously its size. It is an enormous ship, and it took them years to make the Idris. It would probably take them years to make the inside of the Kraken. That said, Drake's style guide at this point, especially after looking at the Corsair, Drake has a lot of ships, bigger ships with interiors. So the Kraken can steal a lot of that. That's part of the reason to make all those ships is you get the asset backs. And unlike the Banu Merchantman, where each component is unique and it's not going to be used on other ships, Drake is very much about doing things cheaply. And so they will very much use, like, the captain's chambers will be just straight across the captain's chambers from the Corsair, and that makes perfect sense with this developer. So once they start making this ship, I could see this one coming a bit quicker than, say, it will probably take about the same amount of time as the Polaris, even though this is a next order of magnitude bigger. You're still, I wouldn't be surprised if we got the shell when we get Pyro, but we're probably not getting the internals of the ship for a few years. I'd say at least 3 to 4 years. They probably won't build out the interiors, but I could be wrong. If they spin up that team, they've got enough assets that this one could surprise people and come out earlier. Again, don't count on that. That's just kind of my opinion of what could happen. Everything going splendidly, which it usually does in in-game development. So the Santokii, this is the medium GN fighter. We've been seeing pictures of it all through the monthly reports on, like, there's little sneak peeks and stuff like that on the weekly reports too. So this ship's pretty far along. I was originally thinking that this thing would probably land in IAE of this year. They might roll it out to us in Alien Week next month. I would be surprised. That would be a long shot, but if they did, it wouldn't be like, oh my God, I never saw that coming, because it looks like it's coming along pretty quickly. Again, it's in development. Medium fighter, we have the tech, kind of, the whole spinning thrusters and everything. We've seen it on the Mirai. We kind of have it on the Cartual, which they're definitely going to revisit someday. But all in all, this ship, it's on its way. It looks like it's most of the way through development. Maybe a couple technical hurdles to go, but it's looking good. I would say definitely this year. Yeah, definitely this year. So this is the SRV, which is the tugboat of the verse, the Argo tugboat. Basically has a really powerful tractor beam that can use to pull other ships out. I think it's a size 3 tractor beam, so it can pull ships. So size 1 is like the handhelds that can move boxes around or bodies. Size 2 can move medium vehicles, and size 3, which they've said is probably going to be the biggest they're going to do, can move ships around. So this is actually the kind of tractor beam that their Reclaimer will have on it, I believe. But SRV, much like the Santokii, pretty much done at this point. The latest you'll see the SRV will be IAE, and most of what's holding this ship up is tech at this point. So it's the tractor beams. So once they have tractor beams of this scale working the way they want them to, we'll probably see these ships shortly after. I would think 3.20 would be likely for this. Whenever they drop 3.20, I would expect the SRV to be in it. They're just not committing themselves to that yet because the tech with the tractor beams might be shaky right now. All in all, pretty cool. Should see it this year. So again, another big one here. This is the Ranger. This is an actual motorcycle, so not a space bike. This thing has 2 wheels. And this one's kind of fun. It's tumbrel. It's probably going to be the smallest vehicle we will get in this game. I mean, I can't, unless they roll out a skateboard or something, I can't imagine a vehicle being smaller than the Ranger. So the Ranger will be able to fit in ships that you wouldn't expect to be able to carry a vehicle. Like this will easily fit in like a Titan. Pretty much it might be able to fit in something like a 100i. We don't know, but Ranger, very, very small vehicle. Serve seems like it would be an easy one to blast out, but the thing with this one is that it actually is waiting on tech, that they're trying to figure out how to make the two-wheel work. Like, I'm assuming balance and how they want it to move. So you think about motorcycles, there actually is a fair amount of mechanics and technical aspects to motorcycles that CIG wants to get right. And as Cameron points out, all the time with ground vehicles, their ground vehicle driving right now isn't the best in the world. Not really a huge need for the Ranger in the verse right now. It's cool, but do we need it? Not at the moment. It would be cool for scouting for like ground troops and stuff like that. But yeah, low priority. If CIG gets a brand new dev in and they want to kind of cut his teeth and they've fixed the tech aspects, we might actually see the Ranger. But as of right now, we haven't heard anything. Who knows? The Nautilus. So this is the mine layer ship. It is a Corvette. So think it's somewhere between the size of a Hammerhead and a Perseus, or the Polaris from what we've seen. So it's not as big as the Polaris, but it's not small either. It's bigger than a Hammerhead. So put this sort of in that capital ship territory. So it's going to take a few devs a lot of time working on this thing to make it happen. The tech isn't in yet. It's a mine layer. We don't have mines in the game yet. The game loop for laying mines everywhere and how we're going to deal with that isn't in the game. I would assume we're going to have some sort of, if I were to guess, the sort of mine game loop, the way they're going to roll it out is they're going to have interdiction scenarios where there's a minefield. Then they're going to roll out a ship that is a mine diffuser, one that goes out there and can turn off those mines or collect them and resell them. Then they're going to roll out the Nautilus. The one exception to that is that lore-wise, the Nautilus is an extremely old ship. And because of that, I was thinking that it would be a dark horse to get into Squadron 42. So both the Perseus and the Nautilus, according to lore, are extremely old ships. So it would make sense that when dealing with an engagement in Squadron 42, we might see those older ships kind of come out as they're like, oh crap, we need ships on the front line, pull that one out of mothballs and send it in there to kind of back up this Idris that just opened up a can of crap because the Van Duel are coming. Just how I think that scenario is going to roll in Squadron 42. We don't know. But Nautilus kind of has 3 strikes against it. Capital ship, tech, and game loop aren't in the game yet. The only thing that's working for it is that it's an older ship. It's an Aegis ship, which they have a pretty well-established style guide. So those things could mean that it could get into production a little bit quicker once they kind of hit their Aegis capital ship mode. Still few years off, unless it's in Squadron 42. So this little bastard is the G12, a lot like the Tumbril Cyclone. It's kind of right in between Tumbril Cyclone and Ursa sized. It's just a hair bigger than the Tumbril Cyclone last we heard. It's a 2-seater. There's a few different variants. This is the cargo variant or the touring variant. They got a racer variant. They've got an anti-air variant. I think, yeah, that's it. It's those 3 for right now. I think that this one is just kind of in that area of priority. A lot like, unlike the Ranger, all of the tech is in, all the game loops are in for these things. It's not a capital ship, so it doesn't have any of the big strikes against it. This one, again, just comes down to dev time and priority. Do they really need to make another little ship like this? Well, normally I'd say no, but they just rolled out another ground vehicle, didn't they? And they're working on the Storm, so who knows? This one's kind of been on the back burner for a while. I think that they... I wouldn't be shocked when they kind of go through and do the X1 when they tackle the 600i. They'll probably tackle the G12 too. If we don't see the 600i rework this year, which it's beginning to look shaky, next year might be Origin's year where they just kind of blow out all these Origin ships, including the G12. So this is the Perseus. I don't know. Someone who's Navy could probably correct me on this. To me, this almost feels like a PT boat or a picket ship. The thing is that it's kind of weird. What it really reminds me of is the Monitor, the sort of first ironclad ship of the Civil War. They had the Monitor and the Merrimack. The Merrimack had like cannons all along its side, and I think it had one in the front, but it basically did a broadside. The Monitor had an actual turret on it, but they were both very slow, but heavily armored, which if I were going to design this ship, I would make it, since it's more of like a patrol ship. Generally, when you're thinking a patrol ship, you want something relatively quick. So maybe give it good straight line speed, especially since it has the turrets. It doesn't need to be super maneuverable. I'd give it decent straight line speed so that it could get to a situation quicker, because if you're going to break up trouble and the trouble can just kind of go, we're leaving, or we're going to another place, or we're just going to stay ahead of you and keep trouble, then you're not really doing your job. So this ship is kind of in a weird place. I'm guessing like a PT boat was a ship that we used in World War II that had, I think, 4 torpedo tubes on it, but a very fast ship, very small, very quick. This is kind of the opposite of that. It's very slow, heavily armored, and it's got those turrets. So, I mean, it's kind of a question if this thing would even be able to keep up with something like a Polaris, which is built around hit and run. So I don't know. This one's kind of weird. That's just kind of my general thoughts on the Perseus, but they've said they're going to work on the Polaris, Perseus, and Galaxy kind of hand in hand. Those are going to go in a chain. We don't know what order. I would assume it's going to be Polaris, Galaxy, and then Perseus, but they might switch that up, especially if the Perseus, like the Nautilus, has a role in Squadron 42. Perseus could move up that chain very quickly. Perseus is a relatively small ship for these Corvettes. Yeah, I think it's a 3 to 4 person crew. The tech's all in. It is a bigger ship, even though it's on the smaller side of the Corvette side. It's still a bigger ship, so it's dev time. So this one kind of falls into that capital ship category. Game loops in the game, tech's in the game. They'll have a pretty good style guide for RSI once they finish the Polaris. So provided they wrap up the Polaris next year, which is iffy, more likely is early 2025. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Polaris for Invictus for 2025, and then see the Perseus and the Galaxy, especially if they have those teams rolled out, also in 2025, 2026. But Perseus, we might be looking at a shorter wait. I know 2 years sounds like a long time, and it is, but that's what we're looking at. So this is kind of a cool one, and shortly after this video drops, probably in a couple weeks, we're going to be hearing about what I think will be this one's bigger brother. So this is the Railen, and it is maybe not the whole C of the GN. It doesn't carry that much cargo, but it does carry a lot of cargo. It's a big cargo mover. That's probably a hair larger than the Connie. So again, kind of in a weird size category where it's in between something like the Connie Taurus and the whole C, maybe Starfarer. This would probably be a good Starfarer comparison if the Starfarer were running its cargo pods as opposed to the tanker pods. GN ship, highly maneuverable, more than likely. It's got these 2 big turrets on the side of it. Really cool ship. They have said that they're going to move it into production, which we knew that they had kind of done another exploration on it. We didn't know they were moving it into production, so that's interesting. We know that they're working on GN and GN cargo for Squadron 42, which maybe the Railen is being prioritized because it's also going to be a Squadron 42 asset. Related to this, probably in a couple weeks, we're going to be getting, I think, the Sulian for Alien Week, which just based, if it's the one that I'm thinking it was on the deliverables, it's going to be this one's big brother. It's going to be a huge ship. And that one is actually in active production. Maybe that's the Railen. That'd be interesting, but I would expect to see the Sulian would be a bigger version of this. We'll see. If they are working on the Railen and it's moving into active production year or so, it's kind of one of those things that this would kind of roughly fall into the tech category, I would say, because they haven't done a Xi'an ship's interior yet. So a lot like the Band of Merchantman, they have to think through this alien race and how would they make an interior for them. Xi'an are smaller than humans. They're shorter than humans. Think like fantasy dwarves is kind of what Xi'an feel like. They're just short, stocky, and bulky. So the ship will feel short, stocky, and bulky as far as like walking through it is concerned, if they do it the way I think they will. And this is truly an alien ship made for aliens that humans use. So that'll take them some time to kind of sort through, which might be if the Railen is, and this is something that I've just started thinking about, if that sort of unannounced concept ship is the Railen, that would kind of make sense for why it had such a long concept phase. But I think it's a Sulian. I think it's going to be something new, and I think we're going to get this later. As for when it could drop, next year, a couple years, depending on how much work they've done, we'll see. Railen was on the progress tracker before, so I would be shocked if they moved it into the unannounced ships after having it be an announced ship. Is weird. You usually don't go that route. And this isn't a ship that the community is clamoring for. Most of the community forgets this thing exists until somebody mentions it. So keeping it in the unannounced ships really wouldn't make sense. So I would say year or two. It'd probably take most of a year in production to get it at least. And now we're kind of getting up into the modern era. So this is the Liberator. Again, it's a very big ship. So that's one strike against it. But the tech and the game loop are largely in the game. It's got landing pads, and it's basically just a big ship mover. Of all the capital ships, this one, I can't think of a reason why this one wouldn't be a piece of cake to get out the door. I mean, I would think it's mostly just flat space and a cargo bay where you can park vehicles. It's basically the C2 without the fancy interior. It's got a little bit of an interior over here and a little bit of an interior over here, and that's it. Like, I could see them busting this ship out in like 6 months. If you were going to spin up like a ship team that was going to build ships, cut your teeth on this one and get it out the door quick. Like, the style guide for Anvil already exists. It's mostly flat spaces that things land on for its game loop. Easy win. I would expect Pyro to drop and this ship to drop pretty shortly thereafter, just because Pyro is so huge. You're going to have something like this. I mean, most people have, the vast majority of backers for this game have a starter package. They have like an Aurora or a Mustang. They're not going to be able to enjoy Pyro because they're not going to be able to get across the thing. So something like this is going to be absolutely necessary for something like Pyro. So I would not be shocked if once Pyro drops, the Liberator is really hot on its heels. I would not expect the Liberator to take a long time to create, but then again, I'm not a dev. But from my perspective, this one would be a low-hanging fruit, easy win for somebody. So this is the Myst Odyssey, the carrot killer, which they definitely said to just troll the community. It's an exploration ship, but that's not really doing it justice. It's more of a, I like to call it an exploitation ship. So where the Carrack is actually doing the whole Enterprise thing, going out on its own, finding lost civilizations and jump points and little points of interest far out in the far reaches of space. The Odyssey is looking for resources to exploit. So it has a huge hangar back here for larger ships. It's got a big miner back here. It can refine stuff. Right now, in the moment for the concept for this ship, they're saying it can only refine its own fuel. I hope they change that and that it can refine fuel for whatever's in its hangar or other ships around it. It would make sense that the Odyssey and Starfarer would have a lot of synergy. But the Odyssey is a large ship that is an exploration ship. So its game loop is kind of hazy right now, a lot like the Carrack. You can do things in the Carrack, but its primary game loop, which is exploration, isn't really in the game yet. And the Odyssey would be in the same boat. So tech is in the game. Pretty much everything about this ship is in the game, except for refining isn't in yet. But it's game loop and its size are what are going to hold this thing back. And the fact that it's one of the relatively newer concepts. If they rolled out the Odyssey next month, people would be real pissed off because there are a ton of ships ahead of it in line. But the Myst style guide is kind of coming along. It's not an overly complex ship, but I still wouldn't expect to see it for another couple years. But that's the Odyssey, kind of a cool ship. I still say that this, maybe if you were to cut it off, like cut off the hangar, this could be the command module for the Endeavor. That'd make a lot of sense. Not that they are doing that, but they could. So this little guy is the Expanse, which, yeah, they really need to rename it. Like, Odyssey is a good name for an exploration ship, but Expanse is a good name for an exploration ship. So Expanse doesn't really make sense for a tiny ship that's a refiner. And this thing isn't that small. It is a single seater, maybe a two-seater refinery ship, but it's the starter ship for refinery. So essentially what this does, you can see the little saddlebags there. It pulls the saddlebags off of either the mole or the prospector, refines the materials therein, and then basically produces them into commodities like refined ore, refined quantanium, that kind of thing. That's what this ship does. Obviously, not a game loop, or the tech isn't in yet. They're working on refinery ships, is on the deliverables. I think it wraps sometime around September. So we could, a lot like the Vulcan, it would make sense to roll out the Expanse pretty close on the heels of that. It's not a big ship, which, especially with all of the focus on Squadron 42 and the ships in Squadron 42, it would make sense to roll out smaller ships than bigger ships. They'd serve an easy win. You can have one or two devs kind of pick at it and build it out as they go. So I would not be shocked to see the Expanse come on the roadmap next year, something like the Vulcan. Definitely within the next 2 years. They don't want to sit on the refining game loop, because it's kind of the last piece in the mining game loop, is being able to refine the ore that you've mined, and then that completes that loop. This is the missing piece. So I would not expect the Expanse next year. I would call the Expanse next year, maybe. So this little guy is Legionnaire. This is a boarding ship. The problem with the Legionnaire is mostly tech and game loop. A boarding ship is that's kind of the easy part. The tech is that this thing hacks another ship and then attaches to the docking ring. So docking ring attachment is kind of in the game now, but they don't have contested docking yet, where this ship doesn't want this ship to dock to it, and this ship is going to. Essentially what this thing does is hack this ship and say, I have permission to land on you, and this ship says, okay, and then it can lock up. That's what the Legionnaire can do. So the Legionnaire is waiting on hacking gameplay, which should be wrapping in the next couple months, barring more dev time needed to do it, which totally possible. So again, Legionnaire is another one that If it dropped next year, I wouldn't be shocked. I also wouldn't be shocked if this is also a Squadron 42 asset. It would make sense as a Squadron 42 asset, which means that it could get fast-tracked over other ships that are older. Even if it's not used for boarding, it could still be used as a drop ship. You could still carry troops down, but we've got plenty of drop ships right now. Got the Hoplite, the Vanguard, or not the Vanguard, the Valkyrie, Prowler, Cutlass Steel, if you want to count that. There's a lot of drop ships in the game. So do we need another drop ship? Maybe not. Do we need a boarding ship? Maybe. Would be kind of cool. Not a huge priority. I wouldn't be shocked if we saw it in 12 years. I wouldn't be shocked if we saw it next year. It's one of those things that could be anywhere in there. If it's a Squadron 42 asset, we're definitely going to see it sooner than later. And now we're getting real close to the end. So this is the Crusader Spirit. This is sort of their answer to the Freelancer and the Cutlass. Medium small ship, 46 meters. Really quite a bit wider than those other ships, but about the same length as a Freelancer, I believe. Maybe a hair taller. I think the Cuddy is fatter through the body, like it's thicker. This thing has kind of got the wings, which are a little bit thinner. But Crusader ships generally pretty quick, pretty fast, maneuverable. This thing will be maneuverable in the air once that comes in. So whereas the Freelancers are kind of beefy and industrial and utilitarian, and Crusader is extremely, Drake is extremely utilitarian and kind of combat focused. The Spirit Crusader ships are kind of on the other end of the spectrum. This one's in production now. Looks like it's easily on target for IAE, if not sooner, but I would 3.20 probably. If that's the IAE patch, we're probably getting the Spirit there. The real question with the Spirits is which ones are we getting? The C1 shouldn't be hard. It has a tractor beam on it, but tractor beam should be out by then. The A1 is a bomber. We have bombs in the game. We don't have size 5 bombs in the game, which is what it carries. But that one shouldn't be hard. The one that is tricky is the E1, and that is the passenger liner, like a Learjet. We don't have that passenger game loop in the game, and that would be key to getting the Genesis Starliner in. And the E1 would be the first ship that does that in this game, kind of does that loop. So the question is, are we getting the E1 at the same time? Don't know. That's the big question mark. So we are getting... I would put it at 99% that we're getting the Spirit this year. Are we going to get all 3? I don't know. That is dependent on game loop. So the Galaxy. Galaxy is subcap. I'd put it kind of in that Corvette size. Modularity, so it's waiting on tech. Game loop. The cargo module of the ship is easy. I mean, you could roll out the cargo version of the Galaxy next week if you wanted to, if you had the ship basically done. But the med module has tier 2 and tier 1 beds, which can actually resurrect you, which technically the Carrack has that, but I don't think that they'll put it in until the full tier 2 and tier 1 medical game loops are in, even though the Carrack has the bed. I think the Carrack's bed is only tier 2. I could be wrong about that. But I don't think they'll make that medical game loop or that medical thing until they do that. We would probably see the Apollo first, would be my guess. Refining isn't in the game, so we'll probably see the Expanse before we see the Galaxy. But modularity, according to John Crew, they've solved the last hurdle on that. So the Galaxy, we know that once they work on the Polaris, they're going to move on to the Perseus and the Galaxy. I would assume they'd do the Perseus first for the reasons I mentioned under that section. The Galaxy would probably come last, but probably not too far off, 2-3 years. I wouldn't be shocked, especially if they can start knocking out 2 to 3 capital ships a year, which is kind of what they're aiming for. Yeah, 2 to 3 years, I would say Galaxy once the Polaris is done. yeah, 2025, 2026, not beyond the pale, but not guaranteed, but it's not super far off. It's not like the Banu Merchantman, which will be dropping sometime in the next decade, but I'm not bitter. And here we are. This is the last one. So this is the Tumbril Storm, the sort of micro tank they had, single-seater tank that they had displayed just a couple days ago. It's supposed to be like a fast scout tank. Kind of an interesting design. One thing I'm hoping they do when they're tackling it and producing it is make it a hair thinner. From what I saw, and I actually think it was Starjump that pulled it out. So again, follow Starjump if you're not already. Was kind of showing how it fit into the Valkyrie, and it looked like it was just a hair too big, which if this thing can only fit in like a Hercules or something that can carry tonks, they did this one wrong. Like, you should be able to deploy this thing ahead of the tonks so that the tonks, the Hercules know where to drop the tonks. That's the purpose of this thing. So if you're bringing it in at the same time as the tonk, you're kind of missing the boat on it. So hopefully they shrink it enough that can fit in a Valkyrie. Then it makes a lot more sense that this would forward deploy with scouts with something like a Valkyrie, coming down into a hot zone, dropping people off, kind of clearing a zone, dropping off troops, dropping off an APC, which hopefully they kind of have an APC version of one of these things where it's not just a one-seater. It has like a little gun and then it has like a back. I do agree with Cameron that the ground clearance on their tanks is kind of a joke, but I get it. It's a game. But yeah, I would make this thing a hair smaller so that it could fit on the Valkyrie, but this thing is currently in production. So, small vehicle. I don't know if they'd finish it by IAE, but Invictus of next year should be easy. Like March of next year, this is not a big vehicle. So, it's a single seater. It's relatively small. Invictus of next year, probably at the latest, barring them suddenly realizing that tanks are a dumb idea or something. Who knows? And so, gang, this is where I wanted to end it. This is all the ships in order. So upper left is the oldest ships we've got, down to the newer ships. Again, some of these ships are in the game right now. It's just they're either waiting a rework or they need a tweak or their game loop isn't in yet. Something like the Idris where it's in Squadron 42 and they don't want to spoil it. Other ones are purely just on the drawing board. Other ones are in production. But this is what we're looking at. So, I mean, you can see it's not hundreds of ships. There are some big ticket ships on there that people have been waiting a long time on. Banu Merchantman, Polaris, Kraken, Orion to a lesser extent. I don't hear people complaining about the Orion too much, but the Crucible is starting to get like a following again, which is kind of neat. Perseus. But you get the idea that these are the ships that are kind of going through, they're awaiting production. And the reasons why they're waiting production largely make sense. And why CIG would be rolling out smaller ships than bigger ships makes sense too. For one, they've got a lot of their dev time is focused on Squadron 42, and a lot of those people that make ships are doing things for Squadron 42. So it's easier to have a dev pull off for a week or two and work on a PU asset and then go back to Squadron 42 than it is to have a dev pull off for a year and a half to make like the Orion, or several devs to pull off and make the Orion. So again, is that one of those things that whose fault is that? Well, it's CIG's, because they chose to make Squadron 42 and the PU concurrently, which they kind of needed to because the PU funds the development of Squadron 42, which is very unusual. Back when I was going to make my computer game, my idea was to make a single player game, release it, and then that would fund the multiplayer game, which would fund the massively multiplayer game. Why CIG chose to make those two projects concurrently, not 100% sure, but CR's been making games a lot longer than I have, and he's released a lot more games than me, which the number of games I've released rhymes with hero. Here we are. So these are the number of ships. Like I said at the beginning, one thing I wish they would do is I wish Jared would pull on John Crew for an hour-long show and just have him go through this list, and kind of like he did with the Polaris, where he was all like, the Polaris will enable us to do the Perseus and the Galaxy, is talk about that. Like, just sort of say, and I get that CIG is really nervous about doing this because this community is crazy pants, to put it mildly, that you say, yeah, you know, we think we might be able to get to that in a year. By the 6 months later, they'll be like, why haven't you done this? And it's just kind of like, well, we said we were going to try to, other priorities came up, but it would be nice to kind of have that marker of, this is kind of our plan. This is what we're thinking of doing, that if we do this ship, it makes this ship possible. We need this game loop before we can do this ship. So until you see this game loop completed and in the game, you're not going to see this ship. Like, it's just not going to happen. Or say something like they did with the Idris. Like, the Idris up there, you're not getting it until Squadron 42 comes out. You can see the outside of it. You might be able to creatively steal it, but you're not getting it until Squadron 42 comes out. Like, just kind of tell us what's their thought process on the priorities. And that's something that's really been missing. When I talk about CIG's communication problems, that's what I'm talking about, is they don't tell us what their plans are anymore because they've been bitten so many times by this community that they're leery of telling us we're thinking of doing this, this, and this, because when they get there and they're like, oh crap, we can't do ABC, we have to do A, D, E, and then we can do B, and then we can do C. And when they start working on D and everybody's all like, where's B? It's all like, well, we had to do this other thing first because it's a reliant tech. So I get why. And I'd be shocked if they ever actually did it, but it would be nice to sort of say, hey, these are the underlying things, and not get way off in the weeds like I'm doing now. But gang, that's all I got for now. Love to hear what your thoughts are down below. Yeah, that's all I got for this one. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and catch you next time.